So, Brazil had emperors? Seriously? An introduction. So, Brazil, you probably know it for football, carnival, and that statue of Jesus looking like he's about to do a massive dive into a pool of something. But did you know it was once an empire? Yes, an actual honest-to-goodness empire with emperors, palaces, and all the imperial trimmings. It's not exactly the first thing that springs to mind when you think of South America, is it? It's a bit like finding out your quiet, unassuming accountant used to be a Vegas magician. Surprising, slightly baffling, but definitely makes you want to know more. This wasn't some blink-and-you'll-miss-it operation either. It lasted a solid 67 years, which in historical terms, is a pretty decent run longer than most reality TV shows anyway. We're going to dive into how this unlikely empire got off the ground, what it was like at its peak, and how it all eventually came tumbling down, hopefully without making you feel like you're trapped in a particularly dull university lecture. Alright, so how does a sprawling colony, largely ignored by its European overlords, suddenly transform into an empire? Well, it all starts with that man again, Napoleon Bonaparte. You know, the French emperor with the iconic hat and an insatiable appetite for conquering Europe. In the early 1800s, Napoleon was essentially playing a continent-wide game of Risk, and Portugal, which had been Brazil's colonial master for centuries, found itself on his to-do list. So, in a move of spectacular self-preservation, the Portuguese Prince Regent, Dom João, along with his entire royal court, we're talking thousands of nobles, officials, and hangers-on, decided to up sticks in 1807 and sail to their largest and wealthiest colony, Brazil. Dom João, who would later become King Dom João VI, actually started to, dare we say, enjoy Brazil. He opened up the colony's ports to friendly nations, mainly Britain because, you know, Napoleon, established a national bank, a royal library, medical schools, and generally started treating Rio as the new heart of the Portuguese Empire. This was a massive upgrade for Brazil, transforming it from a peripheral resource extraction zone into the actual seat of power. Then, in 1815, Napoleon finally met his Waterloo. Dom Pedro, egged on by Brazilian elites who had rather enjoyed their elevated status and the taste of self-governance, was having none of it. By December 1, 1822, he was crowned Dom Pedro I, the first emperor of Brazil. So Brazil is officially an empire, Dom Pedro I is on the throne. What happens next? Well, the early years under Pedro I were, shall we say, a tad rocky. Think of him as a charismatic startup founder who's brilliant at the launch event but struggles with the day-to-day management. By 1831, the political heat got too much, and he abdicated in favor of his 5-year-old son, Dom Pedro II. This ushered in the Regency period, a decade where various political factions vied for power while young Pedro II was presumably occupied with learning his imperial ABCs, and how not to trip over his tiny royal robes. Then in 1840, because everyone was thoroughly fed up with the instability, they declared Pedro II legally of age at the ripe old age of 14. Under Dom Pedro II, things really began to stabilize and in many ways flourish. However, let's not get carried away with the Golden Age narrative without acknowledging the enormous dark stain at its heart: slavery. Section 4. The Imperial caste emperors, abolitionists, and a princess. Let's zoom in on some of the key players in this imperial drama, because history isn't just about dates and events, it's about people. First up, we have Dom Pedro I, the man who kicked things off. Think of him as the lead singer of a band that had one massive chart-topping hit Brazilian independence. Then there's his son, Dom Pedro II, who was the polar opposite. He reigned for nearly half a century and became synonymous with the Brazilian Empire itself. We absolutely cannot discuss the Brazilian Empire without highlighting Princess Isabel, Pedro II's daughter and heir apparent. And it was during her third regency, on May 13, 1888, that she signed the Lei Áurea, or Golden Law, which abolished slavery in Brazil entirely and without compensation to slave owners. Section 5. The cracks appear. Why the imperial coffee got cold. So the empire is chugging along under the seemingly steady hand of Dom Pedro II. Coffee is king, railways are expanding, and Brazil looks like a beacon of stability in a rather turbulent continent. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. One of the biggest, most rotten beams was, of course, slavery. When Princess Isabel finally signed the Golden Law in 1888, abolishing slavery without any form of compensation to the slave owners, the powerful coffee barons and plantation owners who had been the monarchy's financial and political bedrock, felt utterly betrayed. Then there was the military. The Brazilian army had gained considerable prestige and a heightened sense of its own importance following the grueling Paraguayan War from 1864 to 1870. The Republican movement, once a fringe group of intellectuals, began to gain serious momentum, arguing that an empire, however benevolent its current ruler, was fundamentally unsuited for a modernizing Brazil. Section 6, the not-so-grand finale, how the empire packed its bags. So, the scene is perfectly set for the empire's final curtain call. You've got the furious landowners, an army that fancies itself as the nation's new manager, a church feeling slighted, and a Republican movement that's gaining traction faster than a viral cat video. The actual end, when it arrived on November 15, 1889, was surprisingly anticlimactic. There were no epic battles, no dramatic storming of the Imperial palace with torches and pitchforks. It was more like a very firm, slightly awkward, "Excuse me, Your Majesty, but we're going to need the keys to the country now." The central figure in this rather quiet revolution was Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca. Ironically, Deodoro was not a fervent Republican. He actually had personal loyalty to Pedro II and was initially hesitant to lead a coup. However, he was heavily pressured by ambitious younger officers and influential Republican ideologues who saw him as the necessary figurehead to lend legitimacy to their cause. The Imperial family was then politely but firmly informed that they had 24 hours to leave Brazil. Section 7, the Imperial Echo, what Brazil kept from its crown past. So, the empire is over, done, finito, but did it just vanish into thin air, leaving no trace behind? Not quite. Like a particularly memorable song you can't get out of your head, the Brazilian Empire left a lasting imprint on the country, shaping its trajectory in ways that are still discernible today. For one thing, it managed to keep this absolutely enormous continent-sized nation in one piece. While much of Spanish America was fragmenting into numerous independent republics following their own struggles for independence, Brazil, under its two emperors, maintained its territorial integrity.